the Crown Court or the Crown prosecutors or the police representatives come into the family proceedings, and there's a better exchange of information, which happened recently on my other case, which I wish we'd done many months before.
Yeah.
I think we would have had a much clearer view of which way this case was, the particular case I'm thinking of, was shaping.
Yeah.
Meg, was that what you were?
Yeah, that's absolutely, because I think it was always the case, or always in my experience in the past, that you could have a criminal process running and you could have a childcare process running, and they were almost completely separate. And I think for those of us who were involved professionally, you sort of know that there are different levels of proof and that you're looking at things in different ways. But I think particularly for parents, I mean, maybe that's your experience representing parents, you know, they go through and they go, well, you know, I've not been found guilty, or, you know, or the case actually hasn't come to court because, you know, not enough evidence, or all sorts of legal things in relation to the criminal proceedings happen. And then they suddenly find themselves in a care proceedings process where, as far as they're concerned, the criminal process doesn't seem to count, and they're exonerated. Is that your experience?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there was a case just reported in the press last week, wasn't there, with the baby that was found to have rickets, and I think that had some criminal proceedings before, and the parents exonerated in those criminal proceedings, and then they subsequently had to go through a childcare process, and happily that one seems to have ended well for those parents, but that's not always the case, and there are real tensions between the criminal process and the childcare process, and the police budgets really do come into question there, because we do wait many months for just even the most basic police disclosure sometimes. Not necessarily even where there's any sort of forensic evidence or anything involved. It might just be a simple case of wanting to know whether there was some domestic violence reported.
I was thinking of that.
On a particular date or something, and we're asking just for a report of what happened with the police call-out and the police response, and that can take many months to come through.
And do we know why?
A good question. We ask the question is raised many times in the family court, and with blank responses.
It seems to be lack of resources. That seems to be the issue, and it seems to be the issue in everything that we're all discussing today.
I have to say, enlightening to hear about the cuts and such like on that side when we're on the side.
Okay, so I've got the message loud and clear about lack of resources, but you're all sitting here with not actually a policy maker, but somebody who hopefully, through the work of the all-party group and other contacts and questions and debates in Parliament, might be able to influence some of what's going on. You know, before we move on to the Women in Science bit, which we're going to move on to next, have you got one message? Shall we just move quickly round and see what would be your top message? That's a bit unfair, Helen, you've got to go first, but your top message to policymakers.
I think my top message would be that the whole of criminal justice system, and forensic science in particular, has been fragmented with the major changes that have happened recently, and there is a danger that due to budgetary cuts and everything else that we are going to go through the motions to get things done, but there's going to be a potential that things are not going to get joined up. I mean, for instance, at the moment certain cases are going to several providers, where one provider does one bit and another provider does another bit, and there's a question about whether it ever gets joined up at the end, and obviously that's bad for most cases, but if it then leads into a delay in the criminal justice system proceeding with going to court and so forth, then that's a big issue. So my recommendation is to look at the way we can join things up so there's more communication, and both between all the agencies, but also a more joined up forensic process as well, because we're in danger of it fragmenting, I think, in my view anyway.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I would say consistency is very important. I mean, there are other areas of forensic science where there are inconsistencies. So, for example, one point I would make is that if you are unfortunately the victim of a sexual assault, and that would include child victims, then it is very much a postcode lottery as to the type of treatment that you receive, there are some excellent examples of sexual assault referral centres in the UK, but there are other areas of the UK that are severely lacking in those specialist facilities. And I think that there needs to be some consistent approach by the forensic medical examiners as to how they deal with a forensic medical examination. Some better guidelines. There are forensic specimen collection guidelines, and as far as I'm aware, that's all that's available. So I think there needs to be a uniform approach across the whole of the UK, and it's just unfortunate that I feel that this is something that we started to address, and perhaps that has now gone by the wayside with the budget cuts that we've had to deal with. And really, my other point would be just to agree with Helen that I think it's very important to recognise that the forensic practitioners have an awful lot of expertise in setting forensic strategies, and I can understand that police forces who are struggling with their forensic budgets want to have a control over that and want to have an input into setting the forensic strategy. But there really needs to be better communication between the scientists and the police investigators, because we can assist them in giving them the best value for money forensic strategy. But sometimes that's very difficult to establish because it has already been decided in advance which tests will be carried out in that case. And it may be that in the scientist's opinion, they're not the most appropriate tests to carry out.
Okay, so fragmentation, so more joining up and more consistency. Two messages from the scientists. How about the lawyers?
Well, Meg, I don't think I'm going to say anything new here. I think that...
Try.
Well, I don't think it will be, but I would just say to the policymakers is to stop trying to do things on the cheap. You've got to plough resources in if you're going to keep the skills, not only the social workers, and attract good social workers to the job. It's one of the most demanding jobs I think that there is out there for someone to do, because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. We know that. It's nothing new that people have heard. But just from the ground, that's what's happening. It's very, very difficult for a case when it's running. You'll find on a care case, a typical care case, from start to finish, there may be 3 or 4 social workers that have sequentially run the case. And so the person giving evidence at the end of the trial is totally reliant on what's written up on the case notes. And then you may have a situation where you've got to call 2 or 3 social workers from other jobs. It just doesn't work. So if you're going to attract the right people into that profession, you need to make sure you make it as attractive. Being realistic, but making it as attractive as possible.
And this is about the turnover of social workers?
Turnover of social workers.
Agency workers, is that
agency workers. There's... Some agency workers can be on there, can be with a particular local authority for as long as the permanents. But I think it's about valuing the role that those social workers play, having good support for them. Again, it's nothing new. With the lawyers, a bit of self-interest here, but if you don't pay decent amounts of remuneration, then you're going to lose the most able. Perhaps not at this age group, but the younger ones coming up through the ranks. And that will have a knock-on effect with the judges, district judges, high court judges, county court judges. There's going to be a smaller pool to pull out the best. And if my biggest wish, if I'm going to have my wish list, is could we have more courts, please, and more judges?
Right, okay.
Just to say, put it into context, I go to the High Court last week to fix a 15-day hearing on a complex matter, and we're waiting until February. You tell me how that fits in with Munro and a 26... And this is a case that started in November, and we have a hearing in February of 2013. So those children, we've got 3 sets of children, are sitting in care, waiting for February of next year.
And it isn't just the
expert evidence. We're ready to go. We would be ready by the summer.
But just the cost, is it? It's the emotional cost.
It's the cost to those children. They will never be able to give them back that time that they've spent in foster care.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Meg, obviously I would agree entirely with everything that everybody said, but I was hoping that I could finish perhaps on a positive note of something that has worked well. In London, in the last 3 years, there's been a project running in a London Family Proceedings Court, the Family Drug and Alcohol Court, and it's been piloted essentially by District Judge Nicholas Crichton, who has been magnificent in putting this together. Really, I've dealt with 3 or 4 cases in this process now, and it brings together a team of expertise and the facts of each case are looked at by this team, who make a kind of multidisciplinary decision at the outset as to which of them would be the most appropriate people to not only work with the family and to try and... It's obviously dealing just with drug and alcohol issues at the moment, but perhaps this could be expanded into other issues. But they look at the way that they can work with the family, the parent, perhaps the drug-abusing parent, to help them overcome their addictions, whilst at the same time there's a child psychiatrist in the team who can look at issues relating to the children. And then if the team also feels that they need some evidence externally, say for example they do feel that they need a drug hair strand test, they will identify that, and that will be brought to the fore sort of at an early stage in the proceedings, so we know where we're going in the proceedings. And I think that's been a magnificent example, really, of how expertise can be brought in well to work in a case, whilst also listening to the social workers. And it's perhaps what Munro was really getting at.
Well, there's a good example. Do you know anywhere where that's written up, where perhaps people who are watching this could find out a bit more about it? And because there may also, if anybody's got any other good examples where things are working well, they could email in and let us know, so we can pick up on those issues. That would be really useful, and maybe even I can get parliamentarians to perhaps go and have a look at that and do a visit.
I know that if you even just do a Google search,
right,
a lot of news comes up about it, because Nicholas Crichton
and there's a huge amount of international interest. When you ever go before the FDAC court, there'll be Australian justices, as yesterday when I was there, some French professor watching they're intrigued. There are other organisations from in this country as well that are coming to see what's going on in London, and to see if they can translate and make it work in their areas.
Great. OK, so we have got one question in, which we're going to save till our question time, which is in about 15, 16 minutes' time. And we're now just going to have a quick trot round this issue, which, as I say, is a big concern of mine, that we don't have enough women in science or engineering or technology. And we know that those that do go into those areas, 70% don't stay, which is a huge waste of resources. Let's ask our two scientists, what was it that first attracted them in, and what's made them stay, and have they seen some other female colleagues walk on elsewhere to do other things? Do you want to start first, Helen?
Certainly. I've always been interested in science since an early age, and it's something I was very much encouraged to do both at school and by my parents. So it's kind of inevitable that I would end up as a forensic scientist, I think, after finding a leaflet in my careers room at the age of 14. However, I've had other friends and colleagues who've gone down the same route as I and haven't stayed, partly because they've not found it particularly rewarding, not emotionally or from a career satisfaction point of view, but financially. I think it's certainly not just forensic science, but science as a whole. You start off not that well paid, and you have to, in some circumstances, be lucky in your choices that you make as to whether you get a role that both satisfies you professionally but also pays money. I've got colleagues who rely on grants in the subjects they're looking at, and if that grant doesn't come through, not only have they lost their job, but that particular area of science has been lost, and the uncertainty of that sort of profession has driven them away from it. Certainly from my point of view, I think forensic science is actually quite populated by women. I think we certainly see, and certainly I don't know whether Sue will agree, we see about 60 or 70% of women, especially in the last 10 years. There's been an awful lot of young women coming into the organisation. And I put that down to the fact that it's a very popular sort of TV theme, and I think the reason forensic science has caught the imaginations is because it's very easy to demonstrate how it's applicable to the real world.
Yeah, that's a very interesting area, because I mean that was part of the work I did, putting together a pamphlet that I produced last year with the support of the Smith Institute, which said that girls were far more likely to be interested in science or engineering and technology if they could see what those subject would help them do what problems in the world it might solve, whereas boys tended to be interested because it looked how does that work, they were fascinated by the mechanics of things, as it were, whereas girls were interested in what it did. Is that what drew you into forensic science, Sue?
Well, I actually started off in research. I was fascinated by DNA when I very first learned about it at school, and that led me into research. But for the reasons that Helen's already explained, the issues with research